The scripture tonight is Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32. Somebody shout when you have it. Woo! Alrighty. Chapter 11, verse 32. And what more can I say? Time is too short for me to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, gained strength after being weak, became mighty in battle, and put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead raised to life again. Some men were tortured, not accepting release, so that they might gain a better resurrection. And others experienced mockings and scourgings, as well as bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawed in two, they died by the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins, goatskins, destitute, afflicted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts, mountains, caves, and holes in the ground. All these were approved through their faith, but they did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, so they would not be made perfect without us. And you guys that's been here before, you know that I like to start off with a few quotes. It reminds me that I'm not the first one that had some of these ideas. And the first one is, everybody can be great because anybody can serve. You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to make your subject and your verb agree to serve. You don't have to know the second theory of thermodynamics and physics to serve. You only need a heart full of grace and a soul generated by love. Martin Luther King Jr. Pray often, for prayer is a shield to the soul, a sacrifice to God, and a scourge for Satan. John Bunyan. And this is possibly my favorite, well, it's definitely my favorite tonight. There is no neutral ground in the universe. Every square inch, every split second is claimed by God and counterclaimed by Satan. C.S. Lewis. I'm going to say that one more time. There is no neutral ground in the universe. And if you think there is, you're sadly mistaken. Every square inch, every split second is claimed by God and counterclaimed by Satan. C.S. Lewis. The faith chapter of Hebrews has been a source of strength to Christians through the ages because it tells us what God has done and what God can do with a faithful people. In verse 1, we're told that faith is the reality of what is hoped for, the proof of what's not seen. There's a song I was thinking about when I read that said, life is a dream and heaven's reality. If we could grasp that, we could really understand things, couldn't we? Faith is reality. See, because our faith is in the ultimate reality. It means much more than whatever we're seeing around us, because it is the true extent of reality and the proof of what's not seen. In verse 2, we're told that our ancestors were approved by faith. Then it begins to tell us about the people that God used through the ages. In verse 4, we find that by faith, Abel's sacrifice pleased God. And even in his death, his faith still speaks. How many of us have heard the story, learned a lesson from that? His faith speaks down through the ages, because by faith, his sacrifice pleased God. And it wasn't what he gave to God. It wasn't that he could satisfy God with his gift, but it was the fact that he was giving his best to God. He was actually sacrificing it by faith to God. In verse 5, Enoch's faith pleased God. And in his story, we learn that without faith, it's impossible to please God. For the one who draws near to God must believe that he is, and he rewards those who diligently seek him. We find that by faith, in verse 7, Noah obeyed God. And though the world condemned him, He became an heir of righteousness. And if we go back to that thing where faith is reality, look, God told him to build a boat in the middle of dry land, but his faith in God's promise was the reality. He knew the water was coming. He knew it was coming. He knew that if he obeyed God, his word would come true. By faith, in verse 8, Abraham obeyed. He went, and his faith was kind of, it's what the world would try to use as a derogatory term. It's, they like to say, blind. You have blind faith. Well, Abraham actually did not know where he was headed, but he listened to God and he went anyway. He didn't know where he was going, and then he stayed in the foreign land that God had promised him. He set up camp with his family. He lived in tents. He was so sure of God's promise that land was going to be his. He set up tents with his family, and he was looking forward, the Scripture says, and this is awesome. He was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Wow. I'm looking forward to that kind of a city too, huh? Verse 11, Sarah. And when I was reading this, I thought, behind every good man is a great woman. In my case, it's true. Libby's helped me stay steadfast when sometimes I might have wavered, but he sent her to me. And Sarah supported Abraham. She believed that God was faithful to do what he said he would do. And again, it's that hope in a reality. It's that faith in a reality of things that the world was saying, no, that can't happen. There's no way. You're way past childbearing age. But her faith was in the reality of God's promise. It was the reality of what she hoped for. The reality that his promise was true. In verse 17, we go back to Abraham. It's good to be mentioned twice in one chapter. By faith, Abraham did not even withhold his own son, Isaac, from the Lord. For the Scripture says, for he considered God to be able to even raise someone from the dead. See, his faith, again, was in the reality of God's promise. His faith was the reality of God's promise, that even if he went through with what God told him to do and sacrificed his son, even if God did not stop him, that God would find a way, would raise him from the dead, because that promise was in Isaac. So he knew that God would even raise him from the dead if need be. Then there's Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and in verse 23 we find Moses. Moses chose to suffer with God's people rather than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Since Moses considered suffering for Christ, the Scripture says, to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, since his attention was on the reward. Everybody else would have said, hey, man, stay in Egypt. It's easy there. You got it lush, man. It's not such a bad deal. Just hang out with Pharaoh. You got his protection and everything. But he chose rather to suffer affliction with God's people rather than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. Then after the story of Rahab, we come to our text for tonight, and I wanted to repeat it one more time. What more can I say? Time is too short for me to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, gained strength after being weak, became mighty in battle, put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead raised to life again, and some men were tortured, and they wouldn't even accept release that they might gain a better resurrection. Others experienced mockings and scourgings, as well as bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawed in two. They died by the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, afflicted, and mistreated. And the world was not worthy of them.